There are moments in sports when a game-winning shot becomes bigger than the score, bigger than the standings, bigger than the highlight that plays on television for the next 24 hours. Because sometimes the shot isn't the story. Sometimes it's what happens afterward that changes everything. On Monday night, Caitlin Clark delivered another moment that reminded the basketball world exactly why she's become the most watched player in the sport. With the Indiana Fever trailing in the final seconds, she rose from well beyond the three-point line and buried a shot that instantly sent fans into a frenzy. It was the kind of moment that should have united everyone. Coaches celebrating, teammates celebrating, an organization celebrating. End of story. Except that's not what happened. Because within hours of that victory, a single social media post started a conversation nobody inside the Fever organization seemed prepared for. What looked like a harmless caption quickly turned into one of the most discussed topics in women's basketball. Fans began comparing statements, reporters started revisiting post-game interviews, and suddenly, people weren't talking about the shot anymore. They were talking about what led to it. The reason was simple. The version of events that emerged immediately after the game didn't seem to match the version that appeared days later. At first, the message sounded honest, unfiltered, almost accidental. Then came a different explanation, a cleaner explanation, one that left fans wondering why the story suddenly needed to change in the first place. And that's where this gets interesting, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. For weeks, questions have followed Indiana. Questions about coaching decisions, questions about late-game execution, questions about whether the team is maximizing the talents of the biggest star in the league. Every close game, every sideline interaction, every post-game quote has been examined under a microscope. So when conflicting versions of a game-winning possession started appearing, fans immediately connected it to a much larger pattern. Now, to be clear, nobody outside that locker room knows exactly what was said behind closed doors. Nobody can prove why certain comments were made or why later statements sounded different. But what we can do is look at the timeline. We can look at what was said publicly. We can compare the comments. We can examine the reactions. And when you put all the pieces together, the sequence becomes difficult to ignore. Because what started as a thrilling victory over Washington has quietly transformed into something else entirely, a debate about trust, a debate about leadership, and perhaps most importantly, a debate about who deserves credit when the biggest moment of the season arrives. The most fascinating part? The answer may not come from a press conference. It may not come from a social media post. It may not even come from the people involved. The answer may have already been sitting in plain sight from the moment the ball left Sophie Cunningham's hands and found Caitlin Clark beyond the arc. And once you see the full timeline laid out from beginning to end, it's hard not to ask the same question thousands of Fever fans have been asking all week. What really happened in those final 4 seconds? Monday night should have been remembered for one thing and one thing only, a superstar delivering when her team needed her most. That's the version every sports fan loves, the simple version, the clean version, the version where the final shot goes in, teammates celebrate, and everyone goes home talking about greatness. But what happened in Washington has become impossible to separate from everything that followed, because the shot that saved Indiana's night may have also exposed questions the organization didn't expect anyone to ask. The Fever entered the game carrying more pressure than their record suggested. Every game involving Caitlin Clark had become a national conversation. Every possession was being analyzed. Every coaching decision was being debated. Indiana wasn't just trying to win basketball games anymore. They were trying to navigate the spotlight that follows the most talked-about player in the sport. And for much of the night against Washington, it felt like the same frustrations that had followed the team throughout the season were beginning to surface once again. The offense struggled to find consistency, opportunities came and went, momentum shifted back and forth. And as the fourth quarter began winding down, there was a growing sense that another painful loss might be waiting around the corner.
For Caitlin Clark, the evening had already featured the kind of moments that remind everyone why defenses are terrified whenever she touches the ball. She hit difficult shots, she stretched the defense, she created opportunities for teammates. Yet, despite all of that, Indiana still found itself chasing the game in the closing moments. That's what made the final minute feel so heavy. The Fever weren't protecting a lead, they weren't simply trying to close out a victory, they were fighting to avoid another result that would bring even more questions about a team still searching for consistency. Every possession suddenly carried enormous weight, and everyone inside the arena knew it. Then came the sequence that could have changed the entire conversation for a very different reason. With less than a minute remaining, Clark stepped to the free throw line with an opportunity to help secure the game. Instead, she missed both attempts. For most players, especially players carrying the level of attention Clark attracts, those misses would have immediately become the headline. Sports television would have spent hours replaying them. Critics would have dissected them. Social media would have turned them into evidence for whatever argument people wanted to make. That's how quickly narratives are created in modern sports. One missed opportunity can overshadow an entire night's worth of great basketball. But the game wasn't over. Washington still held a narrow lead. The clock continued moving. Indiana managed to keep itself alive. Then, with just seconds remaining, everything came down to one final possession. 4.3 seconds. That's all that separated Indiana from defeat. 4.3 seconds to save the game. 4.3 seconds to rescue the mood surrounding the team. 4.3 seconds to determine whether the flight home would be filled with celebration or questions. When the timeout was called, every camera immediately focused on the Fever bench. Fans leaned forward. Commentators prepared to break down whatever happened next. Somewhere in that huddle, a plan was discussed. Somewhere in that moment, a decision was made about how Indiana would try to win the game. What happened after the ball was inbounded is already becoming one of the defining images of the Fever season. The possession unfolded quickly. Defenders reacted. Passing lanes appeared and disappeared. Everything seemed to happen at once. Then suddenly, the ball found Caitlin Clark beyond the three-point line. Not just beyond the line, but far beyond it. The kind of distance that makes most players hesitate. The kind of shot that instantly causes coaches to hold their breath. Yet hesitation has never been part of Clark's game. She gathered the ball, rose up, and released it with complete confidence, despite the enormous pressure attached to the moment. The instant the ball left her hands, time seemed to slow down. Players stopped moving. Fans stopped breathing. Both benches watched the flight of the shot, knowing that the entire game was hanging in the air alongside the basketball. There are certain moments in sports that feel larger than the score itself, moments where thousands of people are locked into the exact same emotion at the exact same time. This was one of those moments. The arena waited, the benches waited, the television audience waited. Then the ball dropped cleanly through the net, and everything exploded. The reaction was immediate and unforgettable. Teammates sprinted toward Clark, coaches celebrated, the Fever bench erupted. What had looked like another frustrating loss seconds earlier had suddenly transformed into one of the most thrilling victories of the season. Just like that, the missed free throws disappeared from the conversation. The struggles earlier in the game disappeared from the conversation. All that mattered was the shot, a deep three-pointer with the game on the line, a signature moment from the biggest star in women's basketball. The kind of highlight destined to be replayed over and over again across television, social media, and sports shows throughout the week. And for a few hours, that's exactly what happened. Fans celebrated, analysts praised the shot, teammates shared their excitement. The story seemed complete. Indiana had escaped with a victory thanks to another incredible Caitlin Clark moment. It was the perfect ending to a dramatic game and the perfect headline for a league built around unforgettable stars. Nobody was questioning the celebration. Nobody was questioning the result. Nobody was looking for controversy. But hidden beneath all the excitement was a detail that would eventually change the entire conversation. Because while fans were busy replaying the shot itself, something else was beginning to emerge through interviews, comments, and social media posts. At first, it seemed insignificant, easy to overlook, just another post-game remark in the middle of a long season. But as more people began paying attention, a different story began to take shape. A story that had nothing to do with whether Caitlin Clark could make impossible shots and everything to do with how that game-winning moment actually happened. And once people started comparing the different versions of events, the most memorable shot of Indiana's season suddenly became the beginning of a much bigger debate.
If the story had ended with Caitlin Clark's shot, nobody would be talking about this days later. The highlight would have run on every sports network, fans would have celebrated the victory, and Indiana would have moved on to its next game. But the moment the post-game interviews began, a second story quietly started unfolding. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. In fact, most people completely missed it at first. That's what makes it so interesting now. The first version of events wasn't hidden. It was delivered publicly, right in front of reporters, cameras, and anyone willing to listen carefully. Immediately after the game, players and coaches were asked the obvious question: what happened on that final possession? How did Indiana create the game-winning shot? And perhaps most importantly, was that exactly how the Fever drew it up during the timeout? These questions are routine after every dramatic finish. Reporters ask them because fans want to understand how great moments happen. Coaches usually explain the strategy. Players usually explain the execution. The answers rarely become controversial because everyone involved is typically describing the same event. That's why what happened next stood out so much once people went back and compared the comments. One of the most revealing answers came from the players themselves. In the immediate aftermath of the victory, there was no reason for anyone to be defensive. There was no controversy yet. There was no social media storm. There were no headlines questioning coaching decisions. It was simply a group of players discussing a dramatic win. And because of that, the comments felt natural, honest, unfiltered. The kind of answers athletes often give before they realize every word is about to be analyzed by thousands of people online. When players described the final possession, the explanation sounded less like a perfectly executed diagram and more like a basketball play unfolding in real time. Reads were made, decisions were made, opportunities appeared and disappeared within seconds. That's not unusual. Many game-winning plays don't happen exactly as they were designed. Defenders react, offensive players adjust, teammates trust their instincts. Sometimes the best basketball decisions happen after the original plan breaks down. In fact, coaches often praise players for making the right read when circumstances change. That's part of the game. What made these comments so significant was how straightforward they sounded. There was no attempt to create a dramatic narrative, no effort to assign blame, no effort to manufacture controversy. Players simply described what they saw. One player recognized an opportunity, another player delivered the pass, Caitlin Clark found space and did what she does best. The focus remained on trust, instincts, and execution under pressure. Listening to those initial comments, it sounded like a team that had won because its players recognized a moment and seized it. At the same time, the coaching staff offered its own perspective on the possession. Publicly, there was praise for the execution, praise for the players involved, praise for Clark's ability to deliver under pressure. Nothing about the comments seemed particularly unusual in the moment. Coaches frequently highlight successful execution after game-winning plays because victories are ultimately what matters most. But looking back now, some fans believe those early comments contained subtle differences that would later become impossible to ignore. The reason this matters isn't because one version sounded dramatic and another sounded boring. It's because the earliest explanations all emerged before anyone knew a larger debate was coming. Nobody was trying to win an argument, nobody was responding to criticism, nobody was defending themselves against a media narrative. These were the raw reactions that came immediately after one of the biggest shots of the season. That's why so many fans later viewed them as the most revealing comments in the entire story. Then something else happened that pushed the conversation even further. As players left the arena and celebrations continued online, social media started filling with photos, reactions, and messages from those involved in the victory. This is completely normal after a dramatic win. Athletes share memories, teammates celebrate together, fans engage with the content. Most of the time, these posts disappear into the endless cycle of sports news within a day or two. But one particular post refused to disappear. At first glance, it looked harmless, just another celebration after a dramatic victory,
Nothing about it suggested that it would become one of the most discussed moments of the week. Yet within that post was a message that many fans interpreted as confirmation of what some players appeared to be saying after the game. It wasn't a lengthy statement, it wasn't an interview, it wasn't a press conference. It was short enough that most people could read it in seconds. But sometimes the shortest messages create the biggest questions.
Because once fans connected that post to what had already been said after the game, they started noticing something that hadn't seemed important before. The first version of events coming out of Washington was beginning to sound remarkably consistent. The players' comments, the online reactions, the celebration itself, everything appeared to point toward the same basic idea. And that's exactly why what happened next caught so many people by surprise. What transformed this story from a routine post-game discussion into a full-blown debate wasn't a press conference, a television interview, or even a reporter's article. It was a social media post. In today's sports world, that's often where the most revealing moments happen. Athletes spend hours carefully answering questions in front of cameras, but sometimes a single caption posted from a phone creates more discussion than an entire media session. That's exactly what happened here. Because while most fans were still replaying Caitlin Clark's game-winning shot, Sophie Cunningham shared something that immediately caught the attention of people paying close attention. The post itself looked completely normal at first. It was exactly the type of content athletes post after a dramatic victory. Photos from the game, celebration shots, moments from the locker room, images capturing the emotion of a team that had just escaped with an important win. Nothing about it seemed controversial. Nothing about it suggested it would become one of the biggest talking points surrounding the Fever all week. If someone had quickly scrolled past it, they probably wouldn't have thought twice about it. But buried within the celebration was a detail that changed everything. It wasn't a long statement. It wasn't a carefully crafted explanation. It wasn't even a direct reference to the controversy that would later emerge. It was short, casual, almost playful. The kind of thing athletes post all the time without expecting it to become a headline. Yet those few words instantly grabbed attention because of how perfectly they seemed to align with what some fans believed they had already heard during the post-game interviews. Suddenly, people weren't just celebrating the shot anymore. They were talking about how the shot happened. The reaction online was immediate. Fans began sharing screenshots, comment sections filled with interpretations. Basketball accounts started reposting the image. The conversation spread rapidly because people felt like they had discovered something authentic, something unscripted. In an era where athletes are often careful about every public statement, many viewers saw the caption as a rare glimpse into what players actually thought about the final possession. Whether that interpretation was fair or not almost didn't matter anymore. The perception had already taken hold. Then came the moment that really sent the discussion into overdrive. Caitlin Clark herself interacted with the post. Again, this wasn't a lengthy explanation. It wasn't a detailed response. But for many fans, it felt significant because it appeared to acknowledge the message publicly. Suddenly, the post wasn't just sitting on social media. It had become part of a larger conversation involving the biggest star in the league. That alone guaranteed people would continue analyzing every detail. What made the situation especially fascinating was how naturally everything seemed to fit together. Fans looked at the post-game comments, they looked at the social media caption, they looked at the game footage. Then they started building their own conclusions. To many observers, all three pieces appeared to support the same story, a game-winning possession that evolved in real time. Players trusting instincts, a veteran making a read, a superstar delivering when the moment demanded it. It felt simple, logical, complete. And that's when the discussion stopped being about a single possession and started becoming something much bigger. Across social media, many fans began connecting this moment to frustrations they had already been expressing throughout the season. Some questioned whether Indiana was fully maximizing Caitlin Clark's strengths. Others pointed to previous late-game decisions they didn't understand. Still others argued that the final shot demonstrated what happens when the ball naturally finds the team's most dangerous offensive weapon. These weren't official conclusions. They were fan reactions, speculation, interpretations. But once those conversations started spreading, they became impossible to ignore. The timing couldn't have been worse for the Fever. The organization had already spent much of the season dealing with constant scrutiny. Every interaction involving Clark generated headlines, every coaching decision generated debate, every emotional moment on the sideline generated weeks of discussion. Fair or unfair, Indiana had become the center of the basketball world. That meant even the smallest detail could quickly turn into a major story. And what began as a celebratory social media post was rapidly evolving into something far more complicated. By the following day, sports media outlets, podcasts, and online personalities were discussing the situation. Some argued fans were reading too much into a harmless caption. Others believed the post revealed something meaningful about what actually happened during the final possession. Neither side could prove its interpretation, but that uncertainty only fueled more discussion. The less definitive the answers became, the more interested people seemed to get.
What made the entire situation so unusual was that nobody appeared angry. Nobody had publicly criticized anyone. Nobody had launched accusations. There wasn't an obvious conflict unfolding in front of the cameras. Instead, the story grew because people were trying to reconcile different pieces of information that seemed to point in the same direction. The more they examined those pieces, the more convinced they became that they were seeing something important. For nearly 48 hours, that version of events dominated the conversation. Fans debated it, commentators discussed it, social media dissected it from every possible angle. And throughout all of it, one assumption remained at the center of the discussion. The story wasn't changing. The comments, the reactions, and the caption all appeared to support the same basic narrative. Then, just when it seemed the conversation had settled into a consensus, everything shifted. A new statement appeared. A new explanation emerged. And suddenly, the story people thought they understood no longer sounded quite the same. The moment that social media post started spreading, the conversation escaped the control of everyone involved. That's the reality of modern sports. A player can post something in the matter of seconds, but once fans begin attaching meaning to it, the discussion develops its own life. By the next morning, people weren't simply celebrating Caitlin Clark's game winner anymore. They were debating what the play said about the Indiana Fever, what it said about the coaching staff, and what it revealed about the dynamic inside a locker room that had spent months under intense scrutiny. What made the reaction so powerful wasn't the caption itself, it was the timing. The post landed in an environment where many fans were already frustrated. Throughout the season, Indiana's offense had been one of the most discussed topics in basketball. Every game seemed to generate new debates about spacing, shot selection, ball movement, and late-game execution. Fairly or unfairly, much of that criticism landed at the feet of head coach Stephanie White. Every loss brought fresh questions. Every offensive struggle reignited old arguments. Every close game created another opportunity for fans to second-guess decisions being made on the sidelines. So when people interpreted the caption as evidence that the game-winning shot happened outside the original design, it immediately connected with frustrations that had been building for weeks. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about one possession anymore. It became a symbol. For some fans, the final shot represented something larger. They argued that the Fever looked most dangerous when the ball naturally found Caitlin Clark and players trusted their instincts. Others pushed back, insisting people were reading far too much into a celebratory post. But regardless of which side people supported, one thing was undeniable: the debate was growing. Social media accelerated everything. Clips from previous games started resurfacing. Fans revisited old coaching decisions. Comment sections filled with comparisons to earlier moments in the season that had already generated controversy. Every discussion seemed to lead back to the same question. Was the game-winning shot evidence that players had solved a problem on their own, or was the internet simply creating drama where none existed? The more people argued, the more attention the story attracted. What made matters even more complicated was the fact that Indiana had already spent much of the season dealing with public speculation about internal tensions. Several emotional moments had been captured by television cameras throughout the year: competitive exchanges on the sideline, frustrated reactions during games, intense discussions between players and coaches. Most professional teams experience those moments, especially during difficult stretches of a season. But when those moments involve the most famous player in the sport, they receive a level of attention that few other teams have to deal with. Because of that history, fans began connecting dots. Some believed the game-winning possession fit into a broader pattern they thought they had been seeing all year. Others argued there was no evidence to support those conclusions. It's important to note that much of this discussion remained speculation driven by fan interpretation rather than verified facts. But in the world of sports, perception often becomes just as powerful as reality. Once enough people begin discussing the same theory, the theory itself becomes part of the story. The media quickly noticed the growing conversation. Articles began examining the reaction. Podcasts discussed the controversy. Television personalities weighed in with their own opinions. Some commentators suggested the public response revealed deeper concerns about Indiana's offensive philosophy. Others defended the coaching staff and criticized fans for overanalyzing a simple social media post. The result was exactly what happens whenever sports debates gain momentum online. The story became bigger than the original event that created it. And while all of this was happening, the pressure on Stephanie White continued to grow. Whether deserved or not, her name remained at the center of nearly every discussion. Supporters argued that coaches are often unfairly blamed whenever teams struggle. Critics argued that repeated offensive issues justified the scrutiny. The debate became increasingly polarized, with fewer people interested in nuance and more people choosing sides. That's when stories become difficult to manage. Once public opinion starts splitting into opposing camps, every new piece of information gets interpreted through whatever narrative people already believe.
The most fascinating part was that nobody seemed entirely sure what had actually happened. Fans were drawing conclusions from interviews, social media activity, and game footage. Commentators were offering opinions, analysts were proposing theories, but there was still no definitive answer explaining why the final possession had become such a major topic. The discussion was being driven almost entirely by interpretation, and yet the certainty with which people defended their positions made it sound as if everyone had access to information nobody else possessed. As the hours passed, the story only became more intense. Every new article generated more comments. Every new podcast generated more debate. Every repost of the original caption reignited the argument all over again. The Fever suddenly found themselves at the center of one of the biggest conversations in women's basketball, not because of the shot itself, but because of what fans believed that shot represented. For nearly 2 full days, that narrative continued gaining momentum. The game-winning possession became a symbol for every existing debate surrounding the team. Supporters of one viewpoint pointed to the caption. Supporters of another viewpoint pointed to the post-game comments. Everybody seemed convinced they understood what happened. Then something unexpected occurred. Just as the conversation reached its peak, one of the central figures in the story returned with a completely different message. And from that moment forward, the debate stopped being about what happened on the court. It became about why the explanations suddenly changed. For nearly 2 days, the conversation followed a predictable path. Fans debated the meaning of the caption, analysts discussed the final possession, comment sections filled with arguments about coaching decisions, player instincts, and what exactly had happened during those final 4 seconds against Washington. Whether people agreed or disagreed with the growing narrative almost didn't matter anymore. The important detail was that everyone was discussing the same version of events. The post-game comments pointed in one direction, the social media reaction pointed in one direction, the game footage appeared to support that same interpretation. Right or wrong, a consensus was beginning to form. Then, everything changed. Not gradually, not subtly, almost overnight. What had been a relatively straightforward conversation suddenly became something much more complicated when Sophie Cunningham returned to social media with a message that immediately caught the attention of everyone who had been following the story. The reason it attracted so much attention wasn't because it introduced new evidence. It wasn't because it revealed hidden information. It was because many fans believed it directly contradicted the impression left by the earlier comments and caption that had fueled the debate in the first place. The new message was simple, direct, unmistakable. Rather than allowing the existing conversation to continue, it pushed back against the entire premise that had dominated social media for nearly 48 hours. The implication was clear. People were reading too much into the situation. According to this new explanation, the game-winning possession was exactly what had been designed. There was no deviation, no improvisation, no breaking from the original plan, just successful execution. And that's where the controversy truly exploded. Because for many observers, the issue was no longer whether the play had been drawn up a certain way. The issue became the apparent shift in the explanation itself. Fans immediately began comparing timelines. They revisited post-game interviews. They pulled up screenshots of previous posts. They replayed clips from media sessions. The internet did what it always does when conflicting narratives emerge. It started building side-by-side comparisons. Suddenly, people weren't arguing about basketball strategy anymore. They were arguing about consistency. One group believed the entire controversy had been exaggerated from the beginning. They argued that fans had misinterpreted a harmless social media caption and created drama where none existed. From their perspective, the newer explanation simply corrected a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. They viewed the situation as a reminder of how quickly online speculation can distort reality. Another group saw it very differently. They weren't focused on the correction itself. They were focused on why a correction appeared necessary in the first place. To them, the timing felt significant. The clarification didn't arrive immediately after the game. It didn't appear while the initial reactions were forming. It arrived only after the discussion had spread across social media, sports media, and countless fan communities. Whether that timing meant anything or not became one of the biggest questions surrounding the story. It's important to be clear here. There is no verified evidence proving why the second statement was made or what motivated it. Any claims about private conversations, internal pressure, or organizational involvement remain speculation. Fans have certainly offered theories, and social media has been filled with them, but theories are not facts. What we can examine is the sequence itself, and the sequence is what captured people's attention. First came the game-winning shot, then came the post-game comments, then came the social media caption, then came 2 days of debate, then came the clarification.
That timeline is not speculation. That's simply the order in which events unfolded. And for many fans, that timeline raised questions they couldn't stop asking. The reaction to the new statement was immediate. Some praised it for putting an end to unnecessary controversy. Others viewed it as raising even more questions than it answered. Instead of calming the discussion, the clarification often seemed to intensify it. Every new interpretation created another wave of comments. Every attempt to explain the situation generated fresh disagreement. The story had reached the point where even efforts to settle the debate were becoming part of the debate itself. What made the reversal so fascinating was how quickly the focus shifted away from basketball. Nobody was discussing defensive matchups anymore. Nobody was talking about shooting percentages. Nobody was analyzing offensive spacing. The conversation had become entirely centered on communication, perception, and credibility. Fans wanted to know which explanation best reflected what they had seen unfold in real time. And perhaps the most surprising part of all was that the original game-winning shot remained exactly the same. The pass hadn't changed, the basket hadn't changed, the outcome hadn't changed. Indiana still won the game. Caitlin Clark still delivered one of the biggest moments of the season.
Yet, because the explanation surrounding the play appeared to evolve, the story itself had transformed into something far larger than a single possession. By this point, the debate was no longer being driven by the shot. It was being driven by a growing belief among some fans that this wasn't an isolated incident. Fairly or unfairly, people started looking back at earlier moments from the season and asking whether a similar pattern existed elsewhere. And that's where the conversation took another turn entirely. Because once fans started searching for patterns, they believed they found more than just one game-winning possession. By the time the second explanation appeared, many fans had already moved beyond the original question of what happened during the final possession against Washington. Instead, they started asking a much bigger question: why did this story feel familiar? That's the word that kept appearing across comment sections, podcasts, and social media discussions: familiar. Not because people believed they had seen the exact same situation before, but because they felt they had seen a similar sequence unfold throughout the season. Once that idea took hold, the conversation shifted from one game to an entire year of moments that fans believed followed a comparable pattern. To be clear, what follows is largely based on public fan reaction and online discussion, not proven fact. No one outside the organization knows exactly what is said behind closed doors. No one can definitively explain every interaction, every decision, or every statement. But what cannot be denied is that a growing number of fans began connecting this situation to previous moments that had already generated attention. Whether those connections are fair or not is open for debate. The fact that people are making them is not. One example frequently mentioned by fans involves emotional sideline exchanges that have been captured on television throughout the season. Basketball is an intense sport. Competitive players and coaches argue, disagree, and show frustration all the time. Most of those moments are forgotten within hours, but when cameras capture interactions involving Caitlin Clark, they often become national talking points. Throughout the year, several clips circulated online showing visible frustration during games. Some fans viewed those moments as normal competitive emotions. Others interpreted them as evidence of deeper issues. The truth may be somewhere in between, but the important point is that every one of those moments generated discussion far beyond the game itself. Then came what many fans describe as the second part of the pattern. After an emotional clip would gain traction online, explanations would follow. Players would address the situation, coaches would address the situation, teammates would reassure reporters that everything was fine. Again, this is not unusual. Organizations regularly respond to media narratives. Teams routinely clarify situations that have been misunderstood. Yet some fans began arguing that the sequence itself had become predictable. First comes a moment that sparks debate, then comes a wave of speculation, then comes a public reassurance that everything is being overblown. Whether that interpretation is fair remains a matter of opinion. What matters is that many people now believe they are seeing that same sequence repeat itself again. The reason the Washington game amplified those feelings is because the timeline appeared to fit so neatly into the narrative fans had already built in their minds. First, there was a dramatic moment. Then there were comments that seemed honest and spontaneous. Then social media erupted. Then a clarification arrived. To fans who already believed a pattern existed, this felt less like an isolated incident and more like another example of something they thought they had been observing for months.
What makes this especially significant is that perception often becomes reality in professional sports. Once a fan base starts expecting a particular sequence of events, every new situation gets viewed through that lens. That's exactly what appears to be happening here. Some fans are no longer evaluating each controversy independently. Instead, they're comparing every new development to previous ones and looking for similarities. The result is a feedback loop where each new story strengthens existing beliefs, regardless of whether those beliefs are ultimately correct. Another reason this conversation continues to grow is because of Caitlin Clark's unique position within the sport. Most teams don't operate under this level of scrutiny. Most organizations aren't dissected daily by national media, sports podcasts, and millions of social media users. But Clark's presence changes everything. Every decision involving her becomes bigger. Every quote becomes more important. Every interaction receives more attention than it otherwise would. That means even routine situations can evolve into major discussions simply because of the spotlight surrounding the franchise. And that's where the frustration from some fans becomes most visible. Many of them believe the Fever's greatest strength is obvious. They see one of the most dynamic offensive players basketball has ever produced and wonder why every possession doesn't revolve around maximizing that talent. Whether that criticism is justified is another debate entirely. Coaches must manage entire rosters, not individual stars. Basketball is more complicated than simply giving one player the ball. But fan frustration doesn't always operate on nuance, it operates on results. And when people watch Caitlin Clark hit a game-winning shot from well beyond the arc, it becomes easy for them to argue that the answer was sitting in front of everyone all along. That sentiment has fueled much of the discussion surrounding the Washington game. For some observers, the final possession became symbolic of a larger issue they believe exists. They see the play as proof that players trusted their instincts and found success. Others strongly disagree, arguing that this interpretation ignores the realities of basketball strategy and relies heavily on assumptions rather than facts. The divide between those viewpoints has become one of the defining conversations surrounding Indiana this season. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all this is that nobody involved has publicly confirmed the theories being discussed. Fans are building narratives based on comments, reactions, timing, and perception. That's important to remember. Much of the conversation remains speculative, but speculation becomes powerful when enough people participate in it. Over time, theories gain momentum, discussions become larger, and eventually even those who disagree are forced to engage with the narrative because it has become impossible to avoid. By this stage, the debate had evolved far beyond a single caption or a single possession. It had become a referendum on trust. Trust between players and coaches, trust between organizations and fans, trust in the explanations being offered publicly. Fairly or unfairly, that was now the conversation surrounding Indiana. But here's the part that made everything even more interesting. For all the debates about social media posts, interviews, and fan theories, there was still one thing nobody could argue with: the games themselves. Because no matter what anyone said online, Indiana's next matchup was going to provide something far more revealing than a caption or a statement. It was going to provide evidence, and thousands of people were about to watch closely for exactly that reason. At some point, every sports debate reaches the same destination. The interviews stop mattering, the social media posts stop mattering. The theories, the arguments, the endless back and forth between fans eventually run out of fuel. And when that happens, there is only one place left to look for answers: the court. That's exactly where Indiana found itself after the Washington game. Because regardless of which version of events people believed, the Fever were about to play another game, and that game offered something none of the online discussions could provide. It offered a chance to see what actually happens when the pressure returns. What made the next matchup so important wasn't simply the opponent, it was the timing. The Fever weren't walking into an ordinary regular season game anymore. They were walking into a game carrying several days' worth of scrutiny, speculation, and questions. Every camera in the arena would be focused on the bench. Every timeout would be analyzed. Every late-game possession would be dissected in real time by fans already primed to search for clues. Fair or unfair, that's the reality Indiana faced. The conversation surrounding the team had become larger than basketball, and now basketball was the only thing capable of changing it. For many fans, the final minutes of the next game became the most anticipated part before the opening tip had even occurred. Not because of the score, not because of playoff implications, not because of individual statistics. People were interested because they wanted to see who the team trusted when the pressure returned. They wanted to see where the ball went. They wanted to see how possessions were organized. They wanted to see whether the game-winning moment against Washington had changed anything at all. The answers wouldn't come from interviews this time. They would come from decisions made in real time, with defenders closing in and the clock winding down.
That's why so many people began describing the next game as a test, not an official test, not one acknowledged by the organization, a fan-created test, a public test, the kind that emerges naturally when a team becomes the center of a major sports conversation. Fans had spent days debating philosophies, trust, and decision-making. Now they wanted evidence. If the offense flowed differently in crucial moments, many would view that as meaningful. If it looked exactly the same, others would interpret that as meaningful too. In a strange way, almost every possible outcome was destined to reinforce somebody's existing belief. The fascinating part is that sports often reveal truths without anyone intending them to. Coaches don't step into games trying to settle internet debates. Players don't enter arenas thinking about comment sections. Their focus is winning, yet winning itself often provides answers. Pressure strips away a lot of the noise. When the game is close and only seconds remain, teams usually show who they trust most. They show what they believe works best. They reveal their instincts, and instincts are often more revealing than public statements. For Indiana, that reality carried enormous significance. Throughout the season, one criticism repeatedly surfaced among portions of the fan base. Many supporters believed the Fever were at their best when Caitlin Clark had complete freedom to create. They pointed to a range, vision, and ability to produce moments that few players in basketball can replicate. Critics of that argument pushed back, noting that championship teams require structure, balance, and contributions from everyone on the floor. Both viewpoints have merit. But the Washington game poured gasoline on the debate because it seemed to provide evidence that each side could use to support its position. That's why the next game became so compelling. Every late-game possession would feel like a response, whether the team intended it to be or not. If Clark controlled the action in crunch time, some fans would immediately connect it to what happened against Washington. If the offense followed a different approach, others would argue that the coaching staff remained committed to its broader philosophy. The result was a situation where basketball decisions were no longer being viewed solely as basketball decisions. They were being viewed through the lens of an ongoing narrative that had captured the attention of the entire league. And perhaps that's the biggest reason the next test mattered. It wasn't really about proving one side right and the other side wrong. It was about clarity. Fans had spent days examining quotes, captions, interviews, and theories. They had argued about interpretations. They had debated intentions. They had tried to determine what happened behind the scenes. But games have a way of cutting through confusion. They force decisions. They create moments where hesitation disappears and priorities become obvious. The irony is that nobody involved in the controversy could completely control what happened next. A coach can design a game plan. Players can prepare. Reporters can ask questions. Fans can speculate. But once the ball goes up, basketball takes over. The game develops its own story. The pressure creates its own truth. And often the most revealing moments are the ones nobody plans for. That's why so many people circled the final 5 minutes before the game even began, not because they expected a dramatic confrontation, not because they expected public conflict, but because those final possessions represented the closest thing to an answer anyone was likely to get. If the Washington game had truly changed something inside the team, fans believed they would see it. If nothing had changed, they believed they would see that too. And no matter which outcome unfolded, one thing had become impossible to deny. The conversation surrounding Indiana was no longer about a single shot, a single caption, or a single clarification. It had become a conversation about identity, about trust, about leadership, and about whether the most important moments of the season reveal more than any public statement ever could. Which brings us to the biggest question of all. After everything that happened, what should fans actually believe? Because when you step back and look at the entire timeline from beginning to end, the answer may not be as simple as either side wants it to be.